Hello, welcome to another Mundane Monday. It is March 20th, 2023. We're about an hour away from the equinox, so happy spring or fall, everyone. You know, the chart I've been looking at a lot this week is a chart of Hillary Clinton. She isn't in the mainstream news right now, but she's very much in the astrology news because her birth time was finally discovered. The wonderful astrologer Patrick Watson was able to retrieve her birth certificate. And so we have actually a timed chart for Hillary Clinton. And even though if you look on astro.com, you see there are still a couple of questions about it. I listened to Patrick Watson and Chris Brennan talk about it on the astrology podcast, and I feel confident that this is the correct birth time, 6:45 p.m. And so if we pull up the chart, we see, first off, kind of a surprise for someone who's led such a public life that so many planets in her chart are below the horizon. But we see that there's one planet above the horizon, which is her primary light, which is the moon in Pisces. And so that moon, has just been shining away her whole life. She's someone who's really been on stage from the time she was a student, where she excelled and was a debater and would eventually win awards and scholarships and things like that. So always kind of a shining light in the world. We see that Piscean energy too, that she was very drawn to politics, affairs involving public good. Also, when she stepped into the White House as First Lady, one of her first jobs was to work on healthcare reform in her husband's administration. So very much that Pisces moon shining up above the horizon. And that moon is particularly enhanced because it is in trine to kind of an out of sign trine to this Jupiter. And Jupiter in her chart is very strong in its own sign of Sag in her seventh house, about 11 degrees away from her descendant. So this shows that she could rise through a fortunate partnership, which you can certainly see has been the case in her chart. One thing that's kind of interesting about this moon trine Jupiter, in order to make a trine to that Jupiter, it has to step out of the sign of Pisces, which is Jupiter ruled, and into the sign of Mars, or into the sign of Aries, which is Mars ruled. So I think that kind of tells the story too, doesn't it? How Hillary Clinton was on her own career path when she married Bill Clinton, who was then running for governor. She had to put some of her own career goals on hold, and that really has continued throughout her life. And also, if we see that the planets, so many of them are in the sixth house, including her sun. And so these Scorpio planets in the sixth house show someone who works very hard, is very dedicated, but yet everything is in aversion to that first house. And so you don't always get the recognition. You can be overlooked. And so, you certainly see in Hillary Clinton's life and her career, especially, she was overshadowed by Bill Clinton. And then when she ran for president the first time, she was defeated by Barack Obama. And then when she ran for president again, she was defeated by Donald Trump. So that sixth house sun, always trying hard and always less than fortunate. But also notice that sun does have something that really gives it a boost. And that is, it's in mutual reception with its ruler Mars. Mars is in Leo, the sun is in Scorpio. So while she can be overlooked and overshadowed, she does have a really strong life force and dedication and energy that can just really propel her towards her goals. Also, if we notice that this third house has both malefics, Saturn and Mars in the house, and then Pluto has exactly joined Mars. And so this tells us, this is someone who's going to have a lot of struggles in third house matters, especially with it falling, just around her IC in opposing her midheaven. And so when you think about Hillary Clinton's career, she's had a lot of problems with negative press. When she stepped into the White House, she immediately attracted a lot of negative press from the right, who resented a woman who was going to be working in her husband's administration. Even earlier than that, when Bill Clinton was running for governor, she was resented because she kept her maiden name initially. And so she's always struggled a bit with these kind of third house matters, which is the press. Another thing I think that's kind of interesting is people who know her personally say she's a very warm, very funny person. But when she goes to speak publicly and communicate, she tends to come across in sort of a stern, almost schoolmarmish way that people find kind of off-putting. And people who work for her are sometimes very frustrated that the kind of the warm, funny, caring person just doesn't always emerge as she speaks. And so she's got then, finally, we see that a rising sign is Gemini. And so Gemini itself is, very good with communication. So even though you see she's had some struggles to get her point across, she does have that Mars in mutual reception with the sun. And with Mars and Saturn there, she was an excellent debater. And so she was usually able to win her day. But of course, we come back to the fact that we've got this Gemini rising with its ruler Mercury in Scorpio. And so that's another sign that there's this sixth house, first house disconnect here, that when she tries to communicate, she just can't quite get her persona, that image she wants to present across. Mercury, you see in her chart, is also retrograde. So that just goes to show that Mercury retrograde doesn't mean that you have problems mentally. She's a very intelligent, highly intelligent woman. It just means that she isn't always thinking along the mainstream. She can bring unique ideas out. And when you think of how she's kind of lived her life as, first establishing herself as Hillary Rodham Clinton, being not just a typical governor's wife, but someone who had a career. So always kind of bucking the trend a bit with that Mercury retrograde in the sixth house. But that again shows someone who's going to have some frustrated career ambitions, especially when you come back to the fact that Mercury and Venus are both in square to the midheaven. So there's just a struggle there to project who she is. And so if we look at her chart overall, then we see that she's got that wonderful quality, the T-square, which gives you ambition. It gives you drive. A successful person usually does have a T-square in their chart, at least one, because you do know how to roll up your sleeves and deal with the conflicts. She's an intensely private person, all these planets in Scorpio, and yet has lived a very public life. You see Mars and Pluto and Saturn in Leo. And of course, that moon shining up in her 10th house. So she's throughout her life learned to balance that need for privacy and a private life with all these planets clustered around her IC, with a very strong ambition to serve the public good. And so these are all interesting aspects in her chart, but she's got another square in her chart that is difficult as well. Notice she's got Mercury in her first house. Uranus in her first house, which shows that she could have some ups and downs in her life, changes of identity. She certainly went through, she was a brilliant a lawyer, and then she was a governor's wife, then she was a first lady, then she was a senator, then she was a secretary of state, then she was a political candidate, and now she's kind of an elder in the political community. So she's had all these different hats that she's worn and identities that she's carried throughout her life. And Uranus in Gemini, of course, that's a delightful placement for Uranus, because it does like that fluidity, that changeability, that variety. And so while she's been able to successfully wear all these different hats publicly, and notice that she's got a nice sextile to her Leo planets with that Uranus placement, but that's square to the moon again. So that same struggle of trying to project who she is to the public, the moon can be the public in her chart, and then suffering some reversals because of that kind of conflict between who and what the message she's trying to send out and how people are understanding her and responding to her. So my question then, the first question I brought to this chart was, did the aspects in 2016 explain kind of what happened when Hillary Clinton lost the election to Donald Trump? And so let's take a look at her chart on the day or the night of the election. I set it for around 10 p.m. I think I've kind of blocked that whole night out of my memory, but it seems to me it was around 10 p.m. when it was decided that by electoral college votes, Donald Trump was the next president. And so we think, okay, so what was going on in her chart then? And when we think about in 2012, Neptune was up there in Pisces. It had been going through Pisces since 2012. Before then, Hillary Clinton had Neptune in her ninth house, someone who thrived with her midheaven there, working in government, public policy, serving as Secretary of State internationally. So she'd been doing these jobs that were very fulfilling for her, doing well at them. And then in 2012, Neptune kind of crossed over into her 10th house and starting to create trines down here to her Scorpio planets. And so this was when it was realized Barack Obama had been reelected at that point. And so what had happened then was they're starting to look around at who is going to run next. And Hillary Clinton's name keeps coming up. It's kind of like a little magic potion is being sprinkled over her chart, and she's unsure. She's not sure what to do, very much in the nature of Neptune. But as she moves closer and closer and closer to having to decide, that Neptune is more and more and more trining these Scorpio planets in her sixth house, and the vision starts to form. I could be the next president and possibly the first woman president of the United States. One thing that's kind of interesting to note, though, as Neptune was floating into Pisces in 2012, what was it squaring but that Jupiter? So it's almost kind of like a little warning sign there that, maybe some expectations are inflated here a bit. But Neptune moved on and eventually came to reach a trine to her, trine to her sun, and then it was applying to trine her Venus, but of course wasn't quite there yet in 2016. But election night, one thing I remember being so striking that night was that we were at the point where Neptune and the South Node had come together in Pisces. And it just seemed to be that kind of echoed the dispiriting nature of the time, where just there had been so much misinformation and lies and confusion around the election. And at the same time, Neptune was making a very profound square to Saturn in Sagittarius. And so that Saturn then is at the bending of the transiting nodes. And so it was a very difficult time for truth and accuracy to come out. There was even a lot of confusion on election night, not sure what exactly was going on. And so at that point then, we see that this very profound square is falling in Hillary's chart, with the nodes exactly squaring her ascendant descendant line. And so when the nodes reach that point where they're squaring an important planet or axis in our chart, that's very fateful. And when you think of the south node going through our 10th house, this is usually a sign that the tide is going out in the public sphere of our lives. The tide's coming in the private sphere in our lives. So we have kind of these very profound aspects happening on election night. We also note that Saturn is on her descendant election night, so an open enemy, putting then coming to her descendant and overtaking her or overcoming her. We also notice that night, where is Jupiter? Because Jupiter is one of her career planets. It rules her 10th house. And so Jupiter that night was right here. We think, oh, it's right here on her Neptune. So that should be good, right? Realizing dreams. But Jupiter at that time was also squaring, let's see, Pluto. So while she's got Jupiter enhancing dreams and hopes and expectations, her Neptune in the 5th house, it probably going into that night was a very joyful time. There were lots of plans and hopes and expectations, even for a big party with a glass ceiling and everything. So that kind of shows all the glamour of the night, but kind of what comes along to squash it. But that Pluto squaring Jupiter and squaring her Neptune. So it's almost like something very heavy, something very kind of from the depths, something dark came and just kind of like snuffed out the candle, that light that was shining that night for her. And also notice that Uranus in the chart, initially you think, well, Uranus is really in kind of a good spot here for her because at 21 degrees of Aries, it's in trine to her Saturn, which rules her midheaven. So another good aspect. And you notice this is in the house of the audience, the fans, the supporters, trining her Saturn. And so what did happen on that night? She won the popular vote. And so by popular vote, she won the election. But if you go into the weeds, into the technicalities, all very Mercury and Scorpio type things, she lost the electoral vote. And so that Mercury in Scorpio, in retrograde, in her 6th house, her chart ruler was also being impacted by that Uranus. So it's kind of a thing where, like, when you're looking at an event in your life, you have to kind of balance. Are there positive aspects, negative aspects? Are there more positive than negative or more negative than positive? Surely on that night, Hillary Clinton had more negative than positive aspects. And then one other thing that's happening, notice Mars is in the anaretic degree of Capricorn. That's interesting. That's where the 29 degrees Capricorn is where Pluto will be on election night 2024. But notice it's getting ready. It's like 6 seconds away from going into Aquarius. And so it's going out of dignity. It's in dignity and Capricorn going into Aquarius. And once it goes into Aquarius, what is it going to do? She's going to have Mars square Sun. So again, the hopes and expectations, and that this was mentally a very stressful time for her is indicated by the Sun, ruling that 3rd house. So she's had to, I think of all people, all human beings who have lived in this country who've experienced disappointments, she has to be in the list of the top 10, I would imagine. What a crushing disappointment that evening was for her and for the people who were supporting her. So, anyway, my next question that I was asking is, will Hillary Clinton consider running for president again? I think she said no. She's 75 at this time, but of course that hasn't stopped other people being in their mid 70s, even late 70s for running again. So let's look to see what's going on in her chart then during the primary season of 2024. I picked this day because we've got Jupiter and let's see. Oh, let's see. Let's not look at, we'll look actually at the primary season. So we'll look at Hillary's chart with the primary season, as I think that will tell us more about it. I picked this date in April because notice Jupiter and Uranus are coming together. That happens only once every 12 years. So it's an interesting aspect, and kind of make note of where that's going to be in your own chart, because that's usually a time of kind of great invention. You might want to think about good positive changes, taking a leap forward in some way. But let's see where it falls along with the other planets in Hillary's chart at this time. So again, this would be during the primaries, the spring of 2024. And so one thing I was looking at is that, Neptune in her 10th house is not quite done yet. Notice it's floating over her moon. And so I would think that at this time she has been brought into some sort of prominence. It could be that, she's being talked about as a possible candidate, a possible VP, or maybe she's just campaigning very actively for people. Because I think Neptune crossing a 10th house moon, especially a moon that's in such wonderful condition as it is in her chart, would show that she's going to be in prominent in some way in the spring of 2024. And it's especially prominent because Neptune is approaching a trine to that Jupiter, which rules her moon. And so I would think a lot of good attention coming to her then. And of course, you see Saturn back here where Neptune was earlier. And so it's also kind of dazzling her a bit by making a trine to her Venus, and even by a few degrees to her Mercury, her chart ruler. So you can see as Saturn is moving into her 10th house, there might be talk around, will Hillary Clinton be considered to be a candidate in 2024? And especially if, Joe Biden, for some reason, should decide not to run. So anyway, those are kind of the aspects that made me think, I wonder if we'll hear from her in 2024, if she'll reconsider her decision not to run for president again. But then let's see what's happening with that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, because that's such a powerful conjunction at that time. And you say, what's it doing? It's squaring her Saturn from her 12th house. So I'm imagining her at this time thinking, I just don't want to go through. And you think about 12th house repeating old patterns. Don't want to put myself through that again. Mentally, I'm just not up for it. And definitely no one would blame her for making that decision. And notice also that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction is opposing her chart ruler, that Mercury. And so I can see, even though she might be tempted to step back in the ring, there's something here that's just saying, I've got a good life now. I've been able to make a contribution in other ways since I ran for president. I'm content with my life. Don't want to repeat history at this point. So just hard pass, I would imagine her response. And then if you look at one other thing that's going on in her chart at that time next spring, is that she's having Pluto square Sun. So you usually wouldn't see someone with such a heavy aspect, successfully at least, taking on a challenge like running for president. So I would imagine, even though she's got some light in her chart, some indication that she would at least play a role in 2024, I would be very surprised if she decided to make another run at the White House. So in any case, I am very grateful to astrologer Patrick Watson for finding this chart. It's a fascinating chart. I could talk about it for hours. And so it's just nice to have a light shown where we were kind of fumbling around in the dark before trying to figure out what was going on in her highly interesting and very, I would say it's a unique chart with a lot of tensions, a lot of gifts, and just a very strong reflection of the woman herself. So thank you very much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye.